beacon's Blight. The lighthouse loomed before them, a pale sentinel against the gunmetal sky. James Thorne squinted through the salt-caked windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he guided their old station wagon along the narrow, winding road. Beside him, his wife Evelyn clutched a dog-eared map, her eyes darting between the paper and the ominous structure drawing ever closer. "Are you sure this is it, James?" Evelyn's voice quavered, barely audible above the howling wind and the car's labouring engine. James nodded, a tight smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Cairnholm Light, our new home." The car lurched to a stop on a patch of gravel at the base of the lighthouse. As the engine sputtered into silence, the couple sat motionless, taking in their surroundings. Jagged cliffs plunged into a roiling sea, white-capped waves crashing against the rocks in a constant thunderous assault. The lighthouse itself seemed to sway in the relentless wind, its whitewashed exterior stained with streaks of green algae and rust. Evelyn shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her slight frame. "It's not quite what I imagined." James reached over, squeezing her hand. "I know it's not much to look at, Ev, but it's a fresh start. No more city noise, no more nosy neighbours, just us and the sea." His wife's answering smile was wan but genuine. They'd been through so much in the past year, the miscarriage, the mounting debts, the whispers of foreclosure. When the lighthouse keeper position had opened up, it had seemed like a lifeline, a chance to escape and heal. Now, faced with the stark reality of their new home, doubt gnawed at the edges of James's resolve. He pushed it aside, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Come on, let's get our things inside before this storm really hits." They stepped out of the car, the wind immediately whipping Evelyn's auburn hair into a frenzy. James wrestled their suitcases from the trunk, nearly losing his footing on the slick gravel. As they approached the lighthouse's base, a figure emerged from a small grey cottage nestled against the tower. "You must be the Thornes!" The old man's voice carried surprisingly well over the gale. He limped towards them, one gnarled hand extended in greeting. "Tom Blackwood. I've been keeping the light these past 30 years. James shifted both suitcases to one hand, grasping Tom's weathered palm. "James Thorne. This is my wife, Evelyn. We're glad to finally meet you, Mr. Blackwood." "Just old Tom'll do," the man chuckled, revealing a mouthful of tobacco-stained teeth. His rheumy eyes lingered on Evelyn, who managed a small wave. "Well now, let's get you folks settled. Storm's coming in fast, and you'll want to be inside when it hits." As they followed Tom towards the cottage, James couldn't shake the feeling that the old man's gaze held something more than simple curiosity. There was an urgency in his movements, a tension in his hunched shoulders that spoke of barely contained anxiety. The interior of the cottage was Spartan but clean, smelling of wood smoke and salt. Tom ushered them to a small sitting area, his hands trembling slightly as he poured 3 mugs of steaming tea. "Now then," he said, lowering himself into a worn armchair, "there's some things you ought to know about Cairnholm Light. Things they don't put in the job description, if you take my meaning." James and Evelyn exchanged a glance. "What sort of things?" James asked, a cold tendril of unease curling in his gut. Old Tom's eyes darted to the window, where the first fat droplets of rain had begun to spatter against the glass. "It's not just a lighthouse, you see. It's a guardian of sorts. Keeps things at bay. Things that ain't meant for mortal eyes." Evelyn's teacup clattered against its saucer. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man leaned forward, his face cast in deep shadow. "There's an evil out there in the deep, something ancient and hungry. The light keeps it at bay most nights, but sometimes sometimes it finds a way through. A peal of thunder shook the cottage, causing them all to jump. Old Tom's eyes were wide, filled with a terror that James had never seen in another human being. "Whatever you do," Tom whispered, "don't look too long into the dark. And if you see something moving out there, something that ain't natural, don't let it see you looking, because once it knows you've seen it, it'll never let you go." The storm raged through the night, its fury shaking the very foundations of the lighthouse. James and Evelyn huddled together in the narrow bed of their new quarters, sleep eluding them as the wind howled like a wounded beast. In the grey light of dawn, James rose, his body aching from the restless night. He made his way to the kitchen, hoping a strong cup of coffee might chase away the lingering unease left by old Tom's cryptic warning. As he reached for the kettle, a flash of movement in the cottage's small window caught his eye. James froze, his heart thudding in his chest. For a moment, he thought he'd seen something. A shape, vaguely human, but wrong somehow, all angles and shadows where there should have been curves and substance. He blinked, and it was gone. "Just the storm playing tricks," he muttered, shaking his head. But the hairs on the back of his neck remained stubbornly erect. The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine. James tended to the lighthouse, ensuring the great lamp was clean and fueled, ready to pierce the darkness each night. Evelyn busied herself with domestic tasks, scrubbing away years of grime and neglect from the cottage. But as the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, a palpable tension would descend upon them. They found themselves huddling close to the fireplace, jumping at every creak and groan of the old structure. On their fourth night, as James was preparing for his shift in the lighthouse tower, Evelyn grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "James," she whispered, "I think there's something out there." He followed her trembling finger to the window. At first, he saw nothing but inky blackness. Then a flicker of movement, a patch of darkness deeper than the surrounding night, undulating like oil on water. "It's nothing, Ev," James said, his mouth dry. "Just shadows." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were a lie. The shape outside was moving with purpose, circling the cottage with an unnatural, gliding motion. And with each pass, it seemed to draw closer. Evelyn whimpered, burying her face in James's chest. He held her tight, his eyes never leaving the window. "I have to go light the lamp," he said softly. "Will you be all right here?" She nodded mutely, her fingers digging into his arms as she released him. James made his way to the lighthouse, every step an effort as the wind buffeted him. As he climbed the spiral staircase, the feeling of being watched intensified. He could have sworn he heard something scraping against the outer walls, keeping pace with his ascent. Reaching the lantern room, James fumbled with the matches, his hands shaking as he lit the great lamp. As the beam cut through the darkness, he heard a sound, half shriek, half hiss, that chilled him to his very core. Unable to resist, James peered out into the night. The powerful beam of light swept across the churning sea, and for a split second he saw it. A vast, writhing mass of tentacles and eyes rising from the waves. In that moment of illumination, one enormous eye locked onto him, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that defied comprehension. James recoiled, his back slamming against the lamp. Even as he squeezed his eyes shut, the image remained seared into his mind. He knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that the thing in the water had seen him too. And somehow, that mutual recognition had forged a connection he could feel even now, tugging at the edges of his sanity. When James finally gathered the courage to look again, the sea was empty. But the feeling of being watched, of being known by something ancient and hungry, lingered like a cold weight in the pit of his stomach. He stumbled back to the cottage, finding Evelyn curled up in a ball on their bed, her eyes wide and staring. "Did you see it?" she whispered. James hesitated, then nodded. I think it saw me too." Evelyn's face crumpled. "What do we do now?" James had no answer. As he held his trembling wife, his gaze was drawn inexorably back to the window. Out in the darkness, something waited, something that now knew them and would never forget. The night stretched on, and neither of them slept. With each passing hour, the certainty grew. Their lives would never be the same again. They had seen something that could not be unseen, and the knowledge of its existence would haunt them forever. As the first hints of dawn lightened the sky, James made a decision. They needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. "We have to talk to old Tom," he said, his voice hoarse. "He knew about this. He has to know how to stop it." Evelyn nodded, her face pale and drawn. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the cottage, both of them knew that they were stepping into a nightmare from which there might be no waking. The path to old Tom's new lodgings wound treacherously along the cliff's edge. James and Evelyn picked their way carefully, the roar of the waves below a constant reminder of the precipitous drop. The morning mist clung to them, cold and clammy, obscuring the way ahead. "I don't like this, James," Evelyn murmured, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "It feels like we're being herded." James nodded grimly. He'd felt it too, a subtle pressure at their backs, as if unseen hands were guiding their steps. Twice now, he'd caught glimpses of shadowy tendrils in his peripheral vision, gone the instant he turned his head. They rounded a bend, and old Tom's ramshackle cabin came into view. It perched precariously on a rocky outcropping, looking for all the world like it might topple into the sea at any moment. As they approached, the door creaked open. Old Tom stood in the threshold, his roomy eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "Best come inside. It's not safe out here. Not anymore." The interior of the cabin was a cluttered mess of nautical charts, occult symbols, and half-empty bottles. Tom ushered them to a small table, his hands shaking as he poured 3 glasses of amber liquid. "Drink," he commanded. "You'll need it for what's to come." James took a hesitant sip, the whiskey burning a fiery path down his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, Tom, what is that thing out there? What does it want?" The old man's face seemed to age a decade in an instant. "It's old," he whispered, "older than time itself. It slumbered in the deep for eons, dreaming dark dreams. But now it's awake, and it hungers." Evelyn's glass clattered to the table, spilling its contents. "Hungers for what?" Tom's eyes locked onto hers, filled with a terrible knowing. "For us, for our minds, our souls. It feeds on our fear, our madness, and once it's seen you, once you've seen it, the connection can never be broken." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Is that why you left the lighthouse? Because you saw it?" Tom nodded, his gaze distant. 30 years I kept that light burning, keeping it at bay. But one night I looked too long into the dark, and it looked back. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a network of scars crisscrossing his arm. They pulsed faintly, as if something writhed beneath the skin. "It's always there now," Tom whispered. "In the corner of my eye, in the depths of my dreams, waiting, whispering." Evelyn stifled a sob, her face pale. Is there no way to stop it? To break the connection? Tom's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. Oh, there's a way, but the price is steep. He stumbled to a nearby shelf, returning with a worn, leather-bound book. As he opened it, James caught glimpses of eldritch symbols and diagrams that hurt his eyes to look at. This tells of a ritual, Tom said, a way to sever the link. But it requires sacrifice. James leaned forward, hope and dread warring in his chest. What kind of sacrifice? The old man's eyes gleamed with a mix of madness and sorrow. A life freely given. A soul to take your place in its grasp. A heavy silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the distant crash of waves. James and Evelyn exchanged a look of horror, the implications sinking in. No, James said firmly. There has to be another way. Tom shook his head. I've searched for years, boy. There is no other way. Either you feed it another soul, or it will consume you both, bit by bit, until there's nothing left but hollow shells. As if summoned by his words, a shadow fell across the cabin's single window. Something vast and unknowable shifted outside, blocking out the weak morning light. Evelyn screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut James to his core. Tom fell to his knees, clutching his head and muttering incoherently. James grabbed the book and his wife's hand, pulling her towards the door. We have to go. Now. They burst out of the cabin into a world transformed. The mist had thickened into an impenetrable fog, shot through with writhing shadows. The very air seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. As they ran, stumbling along the cliff's edge, James could hear it behind them. A sound like the ocean itself had risen up to give chase, a cacophony of liquid whispers and inhuman shrieks. They reached the lighthouse, slamming the door shut behind them. But even as they huddled together in the relative safety of the cottage, they knew the truth. There was no escape. The entity was here, its presence filling every shadow, every dark corner, and it would never let them go. James clutched the stolen book to his chest, its weight both a burden and their only hope. As Evelyn wept silently beside him, he knew they faced an impossible choice. Sacrifice another to save themselves, or be consumed by a horror beyond imagining. The light outside dimmed as something massive eclipsed the sun. In the growing darkness, James opened the book with trembling hands and began to read. The words on the pages before James seemed to writhe and shift, resisting his attempts to decipher them. Each sentence he managed to read aloud sent jolts of pain through his skull, as if his mind itself was rejecting the eldritch knowledge. Evelyn huddled beside him, her eyes wide and unfocused. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can hear it. In my head. It's singing." He grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Stay with me, Ev. Focus on my voice." But even as he spoke, James could feel it too, a discordant melody at the edges of his consciousness, beckoning him towards madness. The walls of the cottage creaked and groaned, as if straining against some immense pressure from outside. Suddenly, a sound like tearing fabric filled the air. James looked up to see a jagged crack forming in the ceiling, inky darkness seeping through. "No time," he muttered, flipping frantically through the book. "We have to complete the ritual now." The crack widened, tendrils of shadow reaching down towards them. Evelyn screamed as one brushed against her arm, leaving an angry red welt. James found the page he was looking for, covered in symbols that burned his eyes to look at. I think I've got it," he said, his voice hoarse. "But Ev, the sacrifice, one of us has to..." I know, she interrupted, a strange calm settling over her features. It has to be me. What? No, James protested, but Evelyn placed a finger on his lips. Listen to me, she said urgently. You're stronger than I am. You can bear this burden. And... Her voice broke. After everything we've lost, I don't have much left to give, but I can give this. Tears streamed down James's face as he shook his head vehemently. I can't let you do this. I won't. A tendril of darkness wrapped around Evelyn's ankle, beginning to pull her away. She cried out in pain, but managed to grab James's shirt, pulling him close. You have to, she whispered fiercely. For both of us. I love you, James. Now read the damn words. With a sob, James began to recite the ritual, his voice growing stronger with each arcane syllable. The air around them began to vibrate, reality itself seeming to warp and bend. Evelyn's grip on his shirt loosened as more tendrils enveloped her. Keep going, she gasped. Don't stop, no matter what. James forced himself to continue, even as he watched the love of his life being dragged into the growing rift in their ceiling. Evelyn's eyes met his one last time, filled with a mixture of terror and resolute love. Goodbye, she mouthed, and then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. A howl of triumph and rage shook the cottage to its foundations. James screamed the final words of the ritual, his voice raw and broken. There was a moment of absolute silence, as if the entire world held its breath. Then, an explosion of light and sound threw James against the wall, knocking him unconscious. When he came to, weak sunlight was streaming through the cottage windows. The crack in the ceiling was gone, as were all traces of the shadowy tendrils. For a moment, James dared to hope it had all been a terrible nightmare. But Evelyn's absence was a gaping wound in his reality. He staggered to his feet, calling her name, searching every room of the small dwelling. Deep down, he knew it was futile. Days passed in a haze of grief and guilt. James went through the motions of tending the lighthouse, his movements mechanical and lifeless. The nights were the worst. Though the presence of the cosmic entity had vanished, the memory of it lingered, tainting his dreams. A week after the ritual, as James stood at the top of the lighthouse, staring out at the roiling sea, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, walking along the beach far below. A figure with Evelyn's auburn hair. Heart pounding, he raced down the stairs and out onto the shore. But as he drew closer, he realized his mistake. It wasn't Evelyn. The proportions were wrong, the movements too fluid to be human. The thing that wasn't Evelyn turned to face him, its features rippling like disturbed water. For a moment, he saw his wife's beloved face, twisted into an expression of agony and accusation. Then it melted away, revealing a void filled with stars and swirling darkness. A voice that was and wasn't Evelyn's echoed in his mind. You think you've won. You've only delayed the inevitable. I am eternal, and I am patient. One day you will slip. You will look too long into the dark, and I will be waiting. The figure dissolved into mist, leaving James alone on the beach, the taste of salt and despair on his lips. He understood then that his sacrifice had brought only a temporary reprieve. The entity was still out there, watching, waiting, and it wore the face of everything he had lost. James returned to the lighthouse, climbing the winding stairs with leaden feet. As he lit the lamp for the night ahead, he found himself pondering the nature of his prison. Was he the jailer, keeping the horror at bay? Or was he the prisoner, trapped in a limbo of his own making? As darkness fell, James kept his vigil. He knew that he would do so every night for the rest of his life. however long or short that might be. For to falter, to give in to the temptation to search the shadows for a glimpse of Evelyn, would mean the end of everything. The beacon's light swept across the turbulent waters, a thin barrier against the encroaching night, and in every shadow it cast, in every darkened wave, something waited, patient, hungry, eternal. James Thorne stood at his post, the last line of defence against a horror beyond imagining. But the true horror lived within him, the knowledge of what he had done, and the terrible, unending price of survival. For he had seen that which could not be unseen, and though the connection was severed, the memory would haunt him until his dying day. Out in the darkness, something shifted, and the long night began anew.